So, today's the tough one. We're looking at this topic of marriage over the next many weeks, and we're staying on the same passage, Ephesians 5, because it's probably the most famous passage in the Bible talking about marriage and talking about what a Christian marriage ought to look like. It's also a passage, though, that irks some people, that gets people a little riled up because of the part that we're going to look at today. And I told you I'm not going to skip. I don't get a free pass. I'm going to take this head on today, this whole business of wives submit to your husbands and husbands love your wives. Because I know when some of you read that, you start to go one way or the other. You start to either say, this is exactly why I don't like the Bible. And then you say, there's some of these parts of the Bible that I just don't want to read. And you take it, you go up, you pull it away, or you ignore it altogether. You say, this is why I don't like it. Or maybe you even just throw the whole Bible away. This whole business of wives submit. Why should a wife submit to the husband? We'll get to that. Then if, on the other hand, and this is most typical males, if you read this part, you start to sit up a little bit in church and say, good. Pastor says, I get my way. See? Tell her. And you nudge her, and I see some nudges every once in a while of the wife. To do that would be a gross misunderstanding of what Paul's trying to communicate here about what I'm going to call today the purpose of marriage. And I purposely didn't give you an outline. I know normally I print out an outline and I try to be as detailed as possible. I did that very intentionally today. And the reason why is because I know you guys are very smart people. And you'll get ahead of me. You'll look at your outline and you'll start to say, well, okay, what's this whole submission business? And you'll start to get ahead. I don't want you to do that. Because what I'm going to do for this passage that we're going to look at, specifically verses 20 through 27 today. Last week we looked at 21. And I'll recap that in a second. Today we're going to focus on 22 through 27, this whole business of submission and husband's love. But in order to understand it, or even to order to agree with that, you can't start at the part that bothers you. To say, what is this whole submission stuff? When wives have to submit to their husbands. And he doesn't say women to men. I'll explain what I mean by that in a little while. But in order to even get to the point that that's palatable for you, you've got to go to verse 27 and work backwards. So that's what we're going to do today. If you have your Bibles, keep them open, or if you have your phones and you have your Bible on your phone, keep it open to follow along, because what we're actually going to do is start at the end and go backwards. Remember last week I said, if you want to know where to start, go to the beginning. I'm breaking my own rules today. I'm going to the end, because if you don't see the end, if you don't see the end goal of what Paul is saying about marriage, what Paul is saying is the purpose of marriage, then you'll never get to the principles. You'll never let those principles of verse 22 and 23 and so on sink in. You'll never agree with them until you first see the purpose. See here, last week we said the start of any marriage, the start of a marriage comes in verse 21. When Paul says, submit to one another. Out of what? Reverence for Christ. He's saying this, to recap kind of last week. If you weren't here, he's saying, if you believe Jesus did what he says he did for you, if you believe that he died and rose for you, out of reverence of that, out of fear of that, you will then be melted. And you will want to submit to one another. What Paul is saying is that in a marriage, there's mutual submission. So don't just get stuck on the wives submit to your husband's part and say, this is why I don't like this passage. This is why I don't like Paul. This is why I don't like some of what he says in his writings. Pause for a moment, and you know, it's sort of the George Costanza thing, you know, when he breaks up with somebody and he says, you know, it's not you, it's me. Come to the Bible right now and say, maybe it's not you, Bible, maybe it's me. Maybe I have a problem with this passage because it's me, not you. So, I know you never thought I'd say approach the Bible with a George Costanza hermeneutics, but I'm saying to do that. Be George for a little bit. It's not you, it's me. Put that aside for a second, and let's start at the end and go backwards. Here's the point of what Paul's trying to communicate. The purpose of marriage. The submission in it. And then the love in it. The purpose. What's the purpose? Look at verse 27, and he says, this is the purpose. This is what you're meant to do in your marriages, husbands, and consequently wives as well. You both have a role in this. This is your job, he says. And it's to do what? present them as spotless, without wrinkle, without blemish. You see, the core of a marriage ought to be friendship. And when I say friendship, what I mean is deep, abiding companionship, where you look at the other person and you say, I want one day to stand in front of God, and I want you to stand right next to me, and I want to go, ta-da. This is what you always made this person to be. And I worked with you on that. Paul says this is the whole purpose. You don't just get married because of romantic fuzzy feelings. You don't just get married because it's convenient for you. You get married because you look at the other person and you say, I see something about you, of where you're going, your glory self in the future. I see it. You may not see it, but I do. And I want to be part of it. I want one day, you say to your spouse, to present you to God and say, look at it. This is what you always wanted, right? And the other person should be saying that to you as well. See, this is what Paul is saying. Before you get hung up on the submit and the love, before you get hung up on that, focus first on why he's saying it. What's the purpose of the marriage? It's so that you can be the deep and abiding companion to your spouse that they will find in no one else. And if you don't believe me, that's what Paul is saying here. It's actually the narrative of marriage throughout the Bible. Here's one story that I'll give you. Go back to the beginning. Go back to Genesis. And everything that God creates, he gives a benediction, a good word. He creates this and he says, it's good. He creates this and he says, it's good. He creates plants, good. Animals, good. Water, good. Heavens, earth, good. Then he creates the man. And he gives a malediction. He gives a bad word. He says it's not good. Why? He says it's not good for him to be lonely. I will create a companion. And I'm going to break that word down in a couple weeks about when he says a helper. It doesn't really mean that. It means a companion. He says, I'm going to make somebody. And this is why when Adam sees Eve, it's a marriage. And the first thing Adam says, he doesn't say, wow, Eve, you're so hot. Eve, you're so beautiful. Eve, you make me feel so good. What does he say? He looks at Eve and he says, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. I wasn't whole until I had you. See, this is what God creates marriage to be. In the garden, he doesn't put a father and a son or a mother and a daughter. He doesn't do the parent-child thing. He puts a man and a woman. He says, this is what you're made for. Deep companionship. And this means at the very least that a gospel-shaped marriage should be when you and I look at one another or our spouse and we say, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, true friend indeed. Now, let me pause here. Let me say something here that needs to be said, and I don't think it needs to be said. It's rather obvious, but I'll still say it because I think it needs to be said maybe. Gospel-shaped marriage does not mean a happy, hunky-dory marriage. There's this idea that somehow in the church we have to present ourselves and our marriages to one another as being okay. Oh, we never fight. We're okay. And that's exactly the opposite of what Paul's saying here is a friendship. Marriage is friendship. Because he's saying in friendships, you're going to have obstacles. You're going to have bumps. You're going to fight with each other. That's the purpose. That's what a gospel-shaped marriage even means. It's not a cookie cutter, polished marriage. It's a marriage that says, man, am I screwed up? But this person has come alongside me because they see something in me that I may not even be able to see myself. C.S. Lewis puts it this way. He says, eros love. You know, when you start first falling in love, he says that's like looking at each other in the eyes. But he says a friendship love, a friendship marriage is not when you just look at each other in the eyes with warm fuzzies and butterflies, because those wear off after a while. He says a true marriage is when you don't just look at each other eye to eye, but you stand shoulder to shoulder. And you look at the same horizon. And you say, I want to get there, but I need you to help me get there. Paul says, your job is to present the other person without blemish, without wrinkle, spotless, standing shoulder to shoulder. You say, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, shoulder to shoulder. We look at the throne. We're going to the throne, you say to your spouse. And I want to go there with you. It's two people looking. C.S. Lewis finishes it. He has a good quote where he says, where other people only see an it, love has found the you. See, other people in your life, no matter how close they are to you, they're going to see you fundamentally as an it. You have a name, you're that. It's your spouse that's going to find the you in you. It's your spouse that's going to unearth the you that God wants, the glory self. That's the friendship of marriage. That's what Paul says is the whole point of it. It's a journey to a throne. It's preparation for the future. It's looking at one other person and saying, I will stand shoulder to shoulder with you. Because one day I want to get to heaven, and I want God to see what I see now. And I want to be a part of that, you say. I tell this story, and I don't want to embarrass my wife. I don't know if she even intended it this way. I think she did, because she summed this up the best way to me. And it was when we started dating, my wife and I, when we were 22, young 22-year-olds, the world ahead of us. And we started dating in New York City. And we had this sort of whirlwind 2 weeks of dating where we were falling madly in love. 22-year-olds with the future ahead of them. And she was going to leave in 2 weeks to move to Tokyo, to move to Japan. So it was a pressure packed. We spent every waking moment that we could pretty much, had lunch and dinners and cut time out of our schedules just so we could be together all the time. And you get wrapped up, and that's the looking at the you in the eyes. We could stare at each other in a cafe and the whole world would disappear. And nothing's wrong with that. That's good. You should have that. It feels good. But she made a statement to me that's forever shaped me. And it struck me as extremely odd then, and it strikes me as a little odd now, but now I get it. Because I get what Paul's saying. She looked at me one day, and I'm going to misquote this, I'm sure. Mind you, we're 22. And when you're 22, the world seems limitless. And she says, I see you, Eric, as an amazing 28-year-old. And that doesn't sound much now because I'm a lot older. So what it means is this: when you're 22, who thinks 6 years in advance? Who thinks that far in advance? And at the time, I'm saying, what, am I going to peak when I'm 28 and then it's all downhill after that? What's going to go on? And I did kind of peak, and it's been, no, I haven't. She said, listen, what she's saying is this: I look at you now, but I see what you could be, and I want to be along for the ride. Here's the thing about marriage. In marriage, you're going to have to go through hardships, through trials. It's going to be bumpy. And if all you have are warm fuzzies, if the reason why you got married is primarily romantic or relationship or chemistry, you will fail when you get in the woods. Because you will have missed the entire purpose of what a Christian gospel-shaped marriage is. You have a job to do. And your job is to see the other person as God sees them. And you say, I want to work at that. I want to present you without blemish, without spot, without wrinkle. This is why a wedding ceremony, as good as a couple looks, and I've done a couple weddings now, and when you do weddings, the people dress very nicely, and they look the best they're probably ever going to look in their life. The woman looks radiant, and the man is passable most of the time. He's adequate, but they all got their nice suits on and dresses, and they look good. And this is what I want to say at a wedding, but I'm never really going to say it. I'll say it now. That wedding ceremony, whatever it is, it's just dress up. Do you see that? It's just dress up for the final time when you're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with that person again. But this time, it's going to be in front of God. What I mean by dress up is this. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and she often likes to imitate weddings, especially the one from Sound of Music, when Maria gets married. She loves that part. So she'll put like a thing on her head and an oversized blanket around her waist, and she'll tromp down sometimes and do the pomp and circumstances that she's getting married. And you look at it, and it's cute, but it's silly because you say that, I know in my heart of hearts, that's just dress up. One day, she'll walk down a different aisle, with a man shoulder to shoulder, and that person is, that ceremony is just dress up for the final one. When you stand before God and you present that person and say, see, I saw it all along. Marriage is tough. And if you don't start from the place of seeing your role as a companion, the deep abiding companion to that person, you will miss the mark. You'll have a frustrated marriage, or you'll have an empty marriage. But when you start to see the other person as the glory self that they can be, then you start to work at it. Marriage is like going into the woods, and I'm going to quote something from a movie. I do not endorse this movie, so please refrain after church from getting mad at me if this movie is not, I don't endorse it, but it's not that bad. It's called Into the Woods. And if you know the premise of the movie, it came out a couple years ago. Into the Woods, it's about the baker and the baker's wife, and about all these other fairy tales that go on. And it's a confluence of fairy tales. You have Little Red Riding Hood, Jack the Beanstalk, Rapunzel with her golden hair, Prince Charming, Cinderella. It's a musical. And all of these fairy tales revolve around the marriage, the relationship of the baker and the baker's wife. And at the beginning of the story, the baker and the baker's wife are told that in order to have a baby, they have to go into the woods, the dark, scary place. And they have to collect 5 things to lift off a curse. And so they go into the woods, and it's scary, and it's dark, and there's trials, and there's tribulations. And they find some of the things, and then they lose some of the things, and they take 1 step forward and 2 steps back. They're frustrated, and they're haunted by this curse. They're in the woods, and their marriage is being tested. And at the beginning of the story, you hear the baker singing, it's a musical, with the baker's wife, and they're not happy with each other. They're sad. They're discontent, by and large, in their marriage. And then they go into the woods, and there's a song they sing, and don't worry, I'm not going to sing it for you. I know some of you started getting a little nervous. I'm not going to sing it, but I'm going to say it. It's a song that's called It Takes Two. And it's about halfway through the movie when they've gone through these trials. They're in the woods. And they look at each other, and they go back and forth, the baker and the baker's wife, after all these trials. And here's what they do. They start to live out, actually, or sing out, rather, what Paul is exactly saying here. That's the purpose of marriage. And she says, you've changed your daring. You're different in the woods. More sure, more sharing. You're getting us through the woods. If you could see, you're not the man who started, and much more open-hearted than I knew you to be. He comes back. He says, it takes 2. I thought 1 was enough. It's not true. It takes 2 of us. You came through, he says to her, when the journey was rough. It took you. It took 2 of us. It takes care. It takes patience and fear and despair to change. Though you swear to change, who can tell if you do? Because it takes 2. She says, you've changed. You're thriving. There's something about the woods, not just surviving. You're blossoming in the woods, she says to him. At home, I'd fear we'd stay the same forever. And then out here, you're passionate, charming, considerate, clever. And he finishes the song by saying, it takes 1 to begin. But then once you've begun, it takes 2 of you. It's no fun. But what needs to be done, you can do when there's 2 of you. If I dare, it's because I'm becoming aware of us as a pair of us, each accepting a share of what's there. You see, she looks at him and says, we've gone into the woods, and you're not just surviving, she says, you're thriving, you're blossoming. And Paul says, in your marriage, if it's shaped by the gospel, if you know your role, you're going to look at one another, and you're going to say, I want to see you blossom into the thing that I know you always could be. It takes 2, and you came through. That's what it's about. Marriage is going into the woods and seeing the future glory self of your partner. Now, I spent a long time on that. And I know you say, well, now he's got 2 more points. How are we going to get to lunch? You will, don't worry. I can condense. I spent a long time on that because that's the foundation. That's the point at which you and I need to start in verse 27. And once you start to see your role in the marriage, either your current marriage or your future marriage, as friendship, companionship, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, shoulder to shoulder on the way to the throne, when you start to see that, then, ladies, wives, doesn't submission sound a whole lot better? Husbands, doesn't love sound a whole lot easier now? Let me touch on these points before we close, because I have to, and I said I was going to. I'm not going to leave you up high and dry. It does say, wives, submit to your husbands. And it sounds like a controversial command in verse 22 and 25. But a few things you should know. First of all, Paul is not communicating inferiority between women and men. Do you notice that he says wives and husbands? He doesn't say women submit to men. So there's no way in which he's saying that women are inferior to men. You can't make that logical argument from this. He's actually talking about the marriage institution. This is why at the end of it he says, this is all a profound mystery. I don't expect you to understand it. But he says it's for wives and husbands, and it's not an inferior superior relationship. It couldn't be. You remember we said the word submit, what it means last week. It's the word used of a military officer who submits his wills and desires for the greater good of the whole. This is very key. But then secondly, the thing about submit, now you're prone to say, well, what does this mean? What do wives have to submit to husbands about? And the beauty of what Paul does here, he doesn't give the particulars. Do you notice this? He gives the principle, not the particulars. He says, wives submit, but he doesn't say how exactly. He doesn't say what the rules exactly are going to be. Why? Because he's almost saying, I'm going to give you the principle of marriage. You work out the particulars. So what he's saying in essence is, it's not that the husband does the manly things around the house. And it's not that the wife is supposed to do the more feminine things. He doesn't say that at all. He gives a principle, and it's up to you and me then to apply the particulars within our marriage. Who does what? He gives no details on how to apply the submission. He just gives it. Now, as I move from the wives submitting to the last point of the husbands loving. If you're a husband, and if you're still awake here, you're bound to say, okay, all I have to do is love them, done. I love them. Free pass for me today. And you look at the command of the wife and you say, it's infinitely harder to submit, is it not? Husbands, I guarantee, every husband I know who reads this passage says, done, check it off, I love her. I fulfilled my biblical duty of marriage. No, you haven't. Because Paul doesn't just say, husbands, love your wives, period, does he? He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave his life up for you, for the church. What he's calling, this word love in Greek actually has the same stem as the submit. So it's a type of love that he's saying is radically self-sacrificial. He's saying, husbands, you should be prepared to jump in front of a bullet for your wife. That's the love he's talking about. See, men read this passage and they say, love, that's easy. I can do that. But wife, you have to submit to me. And it sounds really evil and twisted, because that is. Because if you as a husband know the deepness of what Paul is calling you to, the type of love that he's calling every husband to, he's saying, you should be willing and able to die for this woman. And I'd argue today, if there's husbands who are hearing this, and if you sit there and in your head you say, I have a real problem because I don't think my wife submits to me enough. I don't think my wife respects me enough, as the Bible says she ought to. If you're the husband who says, I don't think she submits enough to me, I don't think she has enough respect to me, as Paul is saying here, I'm going to push back on you, and I'll say this, husbands. Don't you think that if your wife got a sniff of this type of love from you, that she would wholly and gratefully submit to you? Let me say it this way. If you're saying to yourself, well, I don't think my wife understands this whole submission business because I never get my way. Oh boy. I'd look at you and say, husband, if your wife knew that you would jump in front of a moving bus for her, don't you think she'd want to submit to you? If your wife knew you'd take a bullet for her, Don't you think she'd respect you? Maybe the problem is you, husbands. Maybe the problem is you forcing the submission onto them and saying they're not respecting me enough. But Paul says, husbands, love them as Christ loved the church. See, I spent the majority of the time, before I wrap up, I spent the majority of the time here trying to outline the purpose of this marriage thing. Paul's saying it requires, and it is, deep companionship, abiding friendship, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the same horizon. And when you start to do that, you'll start to see your marriage or your future marriage in a radically different light. You'll start to see it the way Christ sees you and me. The gospel says, the good news is that Jesus looks at you and me with all of our wrinkles, all of our spots, and he says, I come to die for you. And one day, Jesus says, one day he says, you'll be here. And I'll go to God and go, ta-da, I made this happen. Jesus dying for you is not just an example of marriage. It should be the power for your marriage. If he died to make you wrinkle-free,